There was so much perverse incentives to try and deliver performance targets. It became quite a toxic situation. There's a bit of naivety at times about how many calls can be handled through other means other than sending an ambulance. There's a balance to strike.
I remember a manager coming to the station to thank me once because I'd met all my response targets. And I remember asking him and saying, "That's great, but that patient actually died."
To achieve those targets, the scrutiny was absolutely intense. And people did lose their jobs because they weren't able to achieve targets, which became increasingly impossible to achieve.
Increasingly, the move is to move that measure of an ambulance service success away from those priority lights and sirens response times to more patient outcomes. What does that look like in a New Zealand context? Welcome to the final episode of the Great Divide series. I'm Hanwei Lee.
And I'm Lindsay Mackay. And we're joined today by Peter Bradley, the CEO of Hato St John. So I am going to read a bit of your bio here. I give a little bit of your age away here, Peter. So Peter's career in ambulance service spans more than 3 decades. He began on the front line in New Zealand, went on to lead one of the world's busiest ambulance services as chief executive of the London Ambulance Service, and later returned home to lead Hato St John through some of the most challenging periods in its history. You today respond to almost 700,000 emergency calls, cover around 90% of the population and nearly the entire geography of New Zealand, and does so through a really mixed funding and workforce model. Across Peter's career, he has led through major incidents, public scrutiny, and fundamentally different system designs, offering a rare perspective on what really sits behind the so-called Great Divide in the ambulance services. So Peter, welcome to Ambulance Insights.
Good, thank you. Nice to be here.
Peter, Lindsay's talked about some of your leadership in ambulance services across the globe. Leadership in ambulance is often shaped less by titles and more by moments. You've led your crews and your people through some really extraordinary mass casualty events. The London Olympic Games and later events like the Whakaari White Island disaster here in New Zealand. When you look back across your career, is there an event or a moment that changed the way you think about leadership, and why has that moment stayed with you?
I think what's important is that when you, leadership in, you have to earn respect and have credibility, right? And going from New Zealand to work in England, there's an assumption that because you've worked in an ambulance service that you've got to earn it. Moving across to England was probably the biggest life-changing experience. I've been back to England to in the end, run the London Ambulance Service was a big thing for me, and that sort of shaped my leadership, I guess, because you had to go from running what was a smallish ambulance service in Auckland to running a very, very large ambulance service. And so I guess, but that really shaped me through it was a really difficult first 3 or 4 years there, where you really had to, it didn't matter how well respected you were in your previous role, it was like starting from scratch. So that for me was my leadership, having to really be on top form and really prove myself, even though I was a mid-career senior manager. I had to really, that was that first 3 or 4 years back in London.
Yeah, sure. So what, were you CEO of St John New Zealand?
No, I wasn't. I was sort of what's called chief ambulance officer for the Auckland Northland region. So I was in charge of an ambulance service because we had separate ambulance services then.
Of course.
Right.
Yeah.
So I was a sort of senior person, and that's partly why I left, because there was nowhere else to go really in New Zealand. So I was in charge there, and then went down to university for a while.
Yeah, I guess going from a smallish region like Auckland into, I guess, one of the busiest ambulance services in the world would have been quite the quite the contrast.
It was, and I think it's a good test, isn't it? Because it makes you defensive for people who apply for roles who've been in small organisations, a bit like even Jordan Emery going from Tasmania to Ambulance Victoria. There's something, can someone, leadership's leadership, so it can be scaled up. So I think I really had to prove myself because I was from little old New Zealand, so what would you know about, so I think it's about, recognising that you've got to be prepared to take a few steps back in terms of humility but also really make the effort to show that you are capable and suitable for the role. So that's a good thing.
I think it really talks to, that around that transferable skills as a leader. And exactly. I think in paramedicine, it's something that we notice that as paramedics, being 3 paramedics, we're not the best at that. No. Like where we actually realise we don't have to be in the same system where, we can take our skills and transfer them elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's right. And I think increasingly there's a recognition that people can, move around and I think it's very hard to, the sort of going back a few decades, there was always a desire to try and have an ambulance person, as it were, in charge of ambulance services in the UK at least. And of course, by and large, when I was over there, that was the case. But now increasingly they just don't have the people, then that's a whole story in itself. That's succession planning and making those roles attractive for people who are, paramedics by background, who want to have these roles because these are great jobs.
Yeah.
They're challenging, but they're also really rewarding. So we want to encourage more and more senior managers in the ambulance service who've got an ambulance background to be able to, aspire to those roles.
Yeah, definitely. And, one of the things I find with ambulance services is, especially from, I've worked in ambulance and across health, is that ambulance has so much scrutiny, more than I think within health. But sometimes we're compared to health at the same time. When I think to some of the big events that you've managed, in those moments, what do you think about leading in those spaces in an ambulance service compared to what maybe leaders have learned in the health system? Like, do you think there's a difference being a leader in that space?
There certainly is. And of course, you've got a mobile, workforce that are out in the field working shift work from very many different locations. And therefore, you haven't got the benefit of being in a healthcare system where, say, it's all in the hospital, it's all in one location or two locations. That does present a lot of challenges in terms of maintaining a connection. And I think it is very different. There is, as you say, quite a lot of scrutiny, and certainly from a target perspective, less so in New Zealand, but certainly in the UK, the requirement to hit response time targets and to achieve those targets. Whether the scrutiny when I was there was absolutely intense, and people did lose their job because they weren't able to achieve targets, which became increasingly impossible to achieve anyway. So I think an ambulance service scrutiny is different. The health system has a lot of different parts to it, but the ambulance, we are schizophrenic, right? We're part of the health system, but we're an emergency service, and trying to maintain both those, a foot in both camps, I think is important. And sometimes the pendulum swings too far. You become part of the health system, but people you still want to be seen as an emergency ambulance service.
Such a balancing act.
It is a balancing act, yeah.
Do you, just out of curiosity, in New Zealand, so I find when I was in England, I couldn't have necessarily even told you who my CEOs were. They weren't in the media very often.
Yeah.
I came to Australia when I arrived, and they were in the media all the time. I know as being an executive, I was in the media all the time. Is it like that here in New Zealand, or?
No, it's very different.
Very different.
And I think, you've worked in it, but I think my reflection is that the sort of state-run ambulance service, the closeness to politics is much different in the UK and in here. You just don't have that. Even in the UK, it's not the same. The ambulance services are by and large left alone. They aren't sort of a political. They aren't, so we don't have that at all here. No.
Yeah, interesting. I wasn't sure.
Just going back to the scrutiny on ambulance services and the KPIs, we recently had a panel discussion with Jordan, Emery, Nick, and Jason from London, and increasingly the move is to, we're trying to move that measure of an ambulance service success away from those, priority lights and sirens response times to more patient outcomes. What does that look like in a New Zealand context? Are you having success with sort of saying to government, it's not just how fast we get there, but, how we manage, the right care for the right patient at the right
patient
time?
outcome as a focus.
Yeah. It's an interesting conversation in its own right. I guess the whole thing around response times and what ambulance services should be responding to. And I've always had a view that you can't stop people calling 000 or 999. You've got to accept they're going to call. It's what you do with the call when they ring. I think in New Zealand there's no real, for good reason. I think there's no real strong scrutiny on time, but there's no getting away from it. You look at all the patient experience surveys, satisfaction surveys. Speed is always number one.
Yeah.
What do you want from the ambulance service? Speed. Number two, speed. What do you want? Number three, there's an assumption that when you get there, you provide good care. So the trust and confidence comes from speed, and that will always be the case.
Wow.
So I think there's no getting away from that. I do think that I've made some mistakes over my career, because I did a review of the ambulance services in England, a national review, and we looked at response times, and we changed it to try and make it. There's a lot of gaming going on, a lot of lack of transparency over, and there was so much perverse incentives to try and deliver performance targets. Became quite a toxic situation. Ambulance managers were under intense scrutiny. It wasn't unusual for me to check performance 50, 60, 70 times a day on my phone, 7 days a week for 12 years. I think the move's been good. I think there has to be a recognition. There's a bit of naivety at times about how many calls can be handled through other means other than sending an ambulance.
Yeah.
So there's a balance to strike, right? And the system, the health system, and what's available in the system plays a big role in actually how far you can go down the sort of alternative route for that. But yeah, I mean, by and large, I think response times are always a need for trust and confidence and speed for some calls, small numbers, but you still have to have an outlying time for some sort of response or care at least.
Yeah, interesting. Just I guess following on from that, London, millions of incidents a year to St John, where you've got, I think it was 700,000 emergency calls.
Yep.
One of your busiest years on records. What does the difference in expectations look like for you, say, your scrutiny in London Ambulance, scrutiny from government and public in London Ambulance versus here in St John?
Oh, it's like night and day. I mean, it's like absolute night and day. I think there's no real comparison. Yeah, the media interest, the political interest, the health. In fact, in the UK, it was more around the health system expectation rather than the politicians. I think there's a wide the national health, the NHS has got its own superstructure of management, and you're accountable through that structure, through a management structure really, rather than directly to government. I think here it's just very different. There's I think New Zealand's culture is different as well.
Yeah.
Public expects, they want a good health system, but we pay lower taxes, and there's an people in rural areas expect to wait longer. So I think the public here are a lot more discerning or understanding. Whereas in the UK, you tend to get lumped into the NHS as a mess, and it's not working.
Yeah.
So I think it's very hard for ambulance services then to become a separate entity in terms of their own how they're viewed at times. Yeah, it's just, the difference is profound.
Yeah.
We by and large we get left on, and I think the problem has been I've always had this view that you can have. I don't mind the idea of high accountability with proper funding. Mm-hmm. What you don't want is high accountability with no funding. And I think in New Zealand, what I experienced when I joined was no accountability and no funding. So it's on the one hand you get left alone. I'd rather have high accountability, and so I'm absolutely all for accountability. You've got to be accountable. It's public money, right? And the public donate in New Zealand, so you're even more accountable. But with that comes an expectation that you'll get the funding you need to deliver a safe service.
I think that really, we've only been in New Zealand for 24 hours, and we met some of your teams yesterday, and I think it goes to that Kiwi attitude like you talked about. And I think because we definitely experienced that, the welcome and the, sharing of information and talking about the service, your teams are so positive. Like that's what we noticed.
Nice.
Like the culture was lovely to witness, and people were so friendly.
Definitely.
So I just had to call that out.
Yeah,
it was nice.
Yeah.
And I think St John's obviously is big in the community, and it has a brand in itself. And you have a large volunteer workforce still in New Zealand. Coming from, if you think about it with the London model, to then coming to New Zealand as the CEO, and then really, how do you kind of balance making decisions? Because I can imagine it's different when you've got the kind of public money in the UK, and then here you've got to balance the public money, the community, the responders. Like, how do you do that in a kind of forward planning risk way? Like, it seems to me like so many competing factors for you to make decisions. Is it as complex as that?
It's quite we are quite a complex organisation. We are, and it's a strength, but it's also a challenge at times, or has been in the past. So we're an emergency ambulance service, which is our main activity in terms of funding and turnover and people. But we've also got this community charitable service with thousands of volunteers providing community programs. So I think managing that as an entity in totality has been over the years quite challenging. So I think that from an ambulance service only perspective, we've got 2,000 plus frontline staff paid, and then we've got a couple of thousand volunteers. So it's about making sure the model's right, and you've got the right workforce mix and skills for the different areas that you operate in, and that's been a bit of a challenge as well in terms of trying to make sure you've got the right people in the right place at the right time, right? And particularly in rural areas where you've got a large volunteer workforce. So we rely on our volunteers, and it's a good model. We've got incredible volunteers putting a huge amount of time and effort, and our expectation of them has increased over the years in terms of their training. So we're trying to do a lot more and get government support to support their volunteers as well, because it's a public good, and that volunteer contribution is worth over $100 million a year.
Wow.
So, we had some independent research done to say what would what's the business case to justify investing in volunteers, which the workforce provides for a couple of $1 million, $100 million worth of value. So It's really important.
Wow, that's
It's incredibly important.
how's that online? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Peter, throughout this series, we've talked about the Great Divide. Often people assume that's urban versus rural or density versus distance. From your perspective, having gone from one of the most urbanised ambulance services in the world to quite a dispersed
Yes.
urban-rural mix, what's the most challenging aspect of the Great Divide? Is it funding? Is it system design? Is it expectations? Or is it the geography itself?
I think it's probably a bit of all those, inevitably, isn't it? That I think in an urban service, like London, for example, you've got small geography, high density of traffic and people. And I think that the benefit is you've got everything contained within 1,000 square kilometres, and therefore you can, and you've got more access to pathways, more access to different opportunities for patients to be given the right care at the right place, more hospitals. Mm-hmm. So the system design, even though it's got some shortcomings over there, is much more contained and manageable. And even just moving workforce around is just so it's much simpler in that sense. It's notwithstanding the challenges of of the workload but also the 180 ethnic minorities you've got in England and in London. I mean, where that brings its own challenge in terms of trying to make sure you're providing the right service to the right people and that you're culturally aware and culturally sensitive. So that increasingly became an issue to work through, and there's been a lot of work done over the years in that area. I think in a rural, urban, remote setting where you've got volunteers and paid staff, it's trying to get the challenge there is really distance, but also often the people in some of the rural calls are some of the most challenging calls, and therefore you've got distance to deal with and getting resources there quickly, but also making sure you've got the right support for the people who are often the lower train level of people in our rural areas. So getting that response model right is more difficult in a rural setting.
In that rural setting, is there a place for technology in those sort of different systems? And like, so digital tools and data was probably abundant really in LAS versus the connectivity gaps you might have here in New Zealand. What does that look like?
I think there's a lot of work being done from a technology, from a sort of national infrastructure resilience perspective, in terms of the government's invested $1.5 billion in a new communications network for police, fire and ambulance in New Zealand. So it's called Next Generation Critical Communications System. That's big, because often the ambulance services don't get what there's always been, wherever I've worked, there's always, ambulance have got poorer communications.
Yeah,
from police
poor cousins.
Yeah. Or they can always contact, so this is big. This is a sort of 10-year program. So that's really going to, cellular satellite, that's going to make a big difference, and is making a big difference for connectivity. So I think that will really be a game changer for our rural people. It will improve connectivity, improve ability to connect and communicate, but also will mean we can use more tools. We can use more telehealth, more video. So I think that's an area to work on, but recognising that our volunteers have got a time, making sure that they're well equipped to deal with the technology we give them is going to be really important going forward. But fantastic opportunities, and it's an absolute requirement to do that, right? We can't leave ourselves behind in that area. So,
and I think it goes to what you were earlier you were talking about performance times, and I read that under your leadership, but ultimately you've always met your performance times, and which is amazing. I don't think there's many leaders that can say that.
Well, it depends on the targets, right? I put it down to the team. We've got a really good leadership, ambulance leadership team, and people who really done a lot of work over the years. We've got a really good management information and business intelligence stuff to really make sure we're focusing on putting the right people in the right place. It's a big team effort, right? As always.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing that that struck me was not just to be meeting performance targets that we all have agreed. It's not always potentially the best metrics, but you also, have been a leader as one of the most trusted charities, I read as well.
Yeah.
That's outstanding that you've been able to balance both of those.
Yeah, and hence why people want to donate. I mean, it's a very special model, I think, in New Zealand, where, and obviously I'm English by birth, so, and returning back to New Zealand, it was a good reminder for me that not only we've got an amazing volunteering sort of ethos in the country, and in the Hato Hon St John, but also people's generosity to give is just absolutely astounding. Millions and millions a year get given to St John to help run the ambulance service.
And it seems like the public trust is
It's very high.
so high.
Yeah, it's very high.
Which is
Yeah, no,
fantastic.
it's extraordinarily high. Yeah.
I think we all remarked, I knew there was some level of community donations for vehicles, but what really struck us yesterday when we were talking to your people was that every single vehicle is essentially publicly donated, which is
I don't think
mind-boggling
it's
coming from
heard of,
Australia. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's an ongoing debate around getting the model right in terms of the charity, because, it's a whole conversation itself around are you a government or are you, an NGO, and, there's arguments for both, right? I don't, and I'm agnostic about the right, model for who run an ambulance service, but because I've worked in a government run and a charitable run, I think that, as long as you've got the right funding and the right infrastructure and the right people and the right leadership, then it doesn't really matter. But either way, it's getting the right model, right? And I think we've been in a position where we've relied too much on fundraising to run an emergency ambulance service. So now's the time to finally get that right once and for all and say, listen, we can get ambulances donated, but the government needs to pitch up here and pay its fair share.
And we can see, obviously, with the, changing demographic of the communities that's happening and what's coming our way. And we think we've talked about in some of the other podcasts, it's about then keeping that pace as well with the forward thinking as well. I can imagine is something quite complex in this situation as well.
Yeah, no, it is complex. And, we want to innovate and keep doing the right thing. But as we said, you've got to do the basics well too. And I think the big focus of the team, the operational leadership team really has been to get the basics, do the basics well. Yeah. It's all well focused on the nice shiny things, but you've got to make sure, have you got ambulances, have you got uniforms, have you got people, have you got good buildings? So all the basics, because that's what ambulance staff want, right? Am I getting a break?
It's the most important thing.
Yeah, am I getting a break? Am I finishing on time? Do I know when I'm working next? Am I getting paid all right? Have I got the equipment I need? So it's that the old Maslow thing, isn't it? Doing the basics well.
Yeah.
That's been a big focus.
Like we said, you began your career in New Zealand, built senior leadership experience both here and in the UK, and then you've returned home to lead St John. How's that sort of full circle journey shaped how you think about leadership and stewardship?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? I mean, it's quite, I've been just been very fortunate. I don't know how to answer the question directly. I guess I've been fortunate to have had a really good, I'm getting towards the end of my career, obviously, not too long to go till before I finish here, I guess. But I've been fortunate to play senior leadership roles in England and in New Zealand, which is reasonably unique, I guess, and to run two ambulance services. I think I've always stuck to some fundamental principles. I only got into management in the ambulance service because I was a paramedic, and I saw things that weren't happening that should have been happening, and I thought, well, there's no point in whinging about it, Peter. Go and do something yourself. So put yourself in a position where you can make some changes, right? And that's how it all started for me. So I've always had the basics. You do the basics well in management, not just in having the. So for me, it's always been about being accountable, transparent, responsive. It's just basic stuff. Answering emails, following things up, getting back to people, making sure that. So I think but also I've also learned that you've got to not do it at the expense of other people. It's very easy in these senior leadership roles. When I went to London, I went out on the ambulance stations and. I took some post-it notes and wrote down the things that they were telling me and what needed doing, this needs sorting. And then you go back and sort it all out. Oh, that Bradley's a good bloke, isn't he? Wow, he gets everything sorted out. But you don't want to be doing that because you want to empower the managers underneath you. You don't need the credit. And I'm at a stage where I don't need the credit, right, in my career. But you want to make sure the people in the important roles, because the other insight for me has been that in senior leadership, people want thanks from their line manager, not from Peter Bradley or from the chief executive. They want it from the people. That's the most important thing because that's their connecting point. That's the person they deal with the most. So I've learned that a lot of my role is thanking people, by the way. I'm the chief thank you officer. I say that's my job, because it's an important part of what you do, right? Yeah. Showing gratitude. So I've always held on to some principles which have always seen me through, and there's no magic to get into senior roles. It's about, you've got to have some competency, right, and some brains, but it is about just doing the basics and people thinking, wow, he does what he says and he gets stuff done. And there's no magic to it. It's not mysterious.
I think all the sort of the values you've espoused could be core values in many organisations, and I think you've just sort of highlighted the importance of all those basic tenets of leadership. In terms of keeping your people happy. Thank them. Clothe them. Water them. Feed them. It's really important.
It is for sure. And I think you did make it, it's not obvious that you're coming to the end of your career. You said obvious. But,
I'm very mindful of that. I said to someone the other week, because I'm a bit too open about with my feedback, but sometimes when you start your career, I got promoted quite young, And so quite a senior role, quite young. And I always had this thing around being too young and whether I have credibility in front of all these other older men. So I was in the ambulance service, which wasn't quite the same as a police and fire back in the day. And think, oh well, so you had to work extra hard to feel. It was a bit of an imposter syndrome thing. And then you get towards the end of your career, you think, oh shit, they must think I'm too old now. So you still have to prove yourself.
Can't win.
So the important thing is that there can never be complacency. I'm as hungry now or as keen now as I was from. I've been 27 years as chief executive. So you've got to be.
That's amazing.
For me, I've got to make sure I can satisfy myself that every day. I said to my wife yesterday morning, am I adding value? Am I making a difference? Or because I can't just coast. I've got to be doing something which is adding value, and that people think is adding value, and that having no complacency is absolutely crucial because once that creeps in, it's time to go.
Yeah.
So that's been really important to me. Keep learning and keep making sure that you're on top of your game. Yeah.
I think it's so much what you're saying definitely is resonating with me.
Yeah.
I was very young when I got quite senior. I mean, I'm heading into my third decade in ambulance, and sometimes I think, what's next? And I'm not even sure. So it's interesting. So I feel like I could talk to you for ages about that. But it is a really exposing career. It's tiring. You talked earlier about, I know exactly what you were talking about. I used to have 2 phones in my pocket. I used to have to bring one out. I'd be checking that screen. My husband used to ask, what was I doing? Get off my phone. Like, it was a little bit of contention. So I can hear you. But what kept you here, like in ambulance?
I didn't intend to. I mean, before I went to England, I didn't intend to stay in the ambulance service. I was mid-30s and I went and did an MBA down at the university. I went full time, which was a big thing because I actually resigned from my job with my family and moved to the other end of New Zealand and with no prospects of a job. So that was looking back, that's probably the biggest thing I did. The most courageous. I had this sense that I wasn't qualified. You spend your time as a clinician doing more and more training and keeping yourself proficient and learning more skills and going through continuous education. Then you become a manager, and you're a manager now. It's replets. There's no requirement to be. So it doesn't cut. So I've always had a view that as you advance your skills as a clinician, there's a requirement to advance your skills as a manager. Yeah. And so I felt ill-equipped. I wasn't, but I felt ill-equipped. Yeah. And without having a management qualification. So that was the only reason I did it, just for my self-worth. And a sense that I didn't know what I didn't know. So that's what kept me in ambulance was that I went there, did a degree, finished, and I thought I'd return back to Auckland and do something else in health. But then I got approached completely out of the blue about going to England for a job, which I never expected to get. So and when I never expected to get the job, never expected to be offered the job. So that's why I stayed in ambulance. Yeah, really.
Peter, we've sort of talked about the focus on KPIs, but I guess as we know that demand's increasing on ambulance services, we've got ageing populations, we've got workforce pressures with people not like you and us being career ambos, but maybe being in the system 5, 6, 7 years at the most. And constrained funding as well, which we've definitely seen post-COVID. What worries you most about the next decade and what gives you confidence?
You touch on the workforce as a big issue, right? Because people people are increasingly sort of more mobile with their careers. I think it's probably a bit of a red herring to think that everyone's going to leave and become an extended care paramedic and working in the parts of the health system at small numbers, right? But at the same time, I think as the paramedic registration, increased clinical pathways, a desire to get more people working in the wider health system and primary care, I think there's an issue around workforce support, workforce management, and workforce planning longer term, all right, for the workforce and what the workforce should look like in the future. I think we've been pretty good at that overall. How do you retain a workforce who join at 20 and then by the time they're 27 want to change? So that concerns me about what's the answer there. Because it's you're in a constant people leave, recruit. It's a sort of constant cycle. So you've got to manage that and keep people join this job because we've got a purpose, right? And they enjoy what they do. So it's about making sure that you look after your workforce the best you can. But that will remain a challenge. No matter how good an employer you are, people still want to, get to 27, 28.
Going to move on.
Want to move on. Yep. But then often return. So how's that managed, and how do we connect that with a wider workforce planning of the health system? I guess is a challenge. Technology is exciting because there's so much opportunity there for technology. So much more in the comm centre. I've always thought the comm centre was the most important part. That's where the investment needs. The clinical leadership needs to be in there. The investment needs to be in there. Because that's the decisions that are made in there, and the leadership and the clinical have a massive downstream impacts. So I think we really need to see a lot more investment in comm centres around technology, but also around clinical support and leadership in those centres. As increasingly as because the risk, we carry the risk, right? We carry the risk for all. We sort of talk about 50% of patients we attend, 50% of pet calls we don't get an ambulance. Well, great, but who's bearing the risk for that? We're bearing the risk. And as the pressure comes on to do more and more of that, then the risk increases, right? So managing that risk, managing the clinical governance aspects of that is really important going forward. I sometimes joke that actually, if you're doing a really good job, then 100% of the people 100% of people that you attend go to hospital, because you'd only go to those that need to go to hospital, right?
Yeah.
So you get to a position where there's nowhere else to go with that. And I think in New Zealand there are limited, compared to England, there are far fewer pathways for patients. We're a small population, 5 million people, so that's a challenge. So maximising pathways, maximising the use of data for integration purposes to get the patient flow right. We are small enough in New Zealand and innovative enough to be able to really put a good package together for innovation and data management technology. So, yeah.
I think you're really speaking to the heart of Hanwei and I, coming from comm centre backgrounds. I think I always talk about it being it's the kind of heart of the ambulance service. And I think
it is,
people don't always realise that. But if we get it right and we invest well, it has that ripple effect to help every sector of the ambulance service. It's a really missed link, I feel, in leaders in across ambulance. They're so focused on the fleet and the movement of those paramedics, which is so important. But if we can get that background in the engine room of the ambulance service working well,
and it needs to be seen as a profession in its own right? It needs to be something that people aspire to. I'm getting towards the end of my career, I'll go back to the comm centre. No, actually, it's actually a career choice, and it's actually a great career, exciting. The prospects are good. And using technology to best effect is a fantastic opportunity. So I think we need to really put our money where our mouth is there, so to speak.
Yeah,
I think we have seen that sort of change in focus with the increased spending on secondary triage, certainly in New Zealand and very much in Victoria.
Yes.
We always say when I started in there was a single paramedic taking all the secondary triage calls for MAS as it was then.
Yeah.
And now there's
300 plus.
300 plus. Taking 30%?
Yeah.
Of 000 call volume.
Brilliant, that's fantastic. Yeah. So there's a big change.
And I think it goes right back to your comment there about seeing it as a professional pathway. I think that was a big thing I noticed when I started working in those environments. People used to describe themselves to me as it was a dumping ground. They said, I just came here because I was dumped here.
I've got to sort back. Go to the comm centre.
So it was one of the big things I can say that was successful at AV, at Ambulance Victoria, was the fact that actually people saw it as a career choice and they chose. And if you actually didn't want to be there, we'll help you find something that you do want to do, but it's not a dumping ground. Because it's such a highly skilled role.
It is high skilled, and I think, getting the prioritisation system sorted out once and for all, the primary triage, that's long overdue, long overdue. Been talking about getting out of AMPDS or ProQA. That's there hasn't been enough appetite to really do something about that. It's got to happen.
It does have to happen. There's a big push around in that at Victoria as well.
Good.
So you've mentioned quite a few things, but if you had to have that if you had to challenge the global ambulance sector as being a global leader, to rethink kind of one assumption it kind of holds about ambulance services to kind of progress it to that next generation, is there one thing that you could think? Do you think there's one thing holding us back?
Not necessarily. I do think, I think there's a bit about what we've talked about. There is definitely a bit about the primary triage piece and the opportunity there to really do something different around how calls, the discretion that the call takers are, the call taker profession, not a profession necessarily in some people's eyes. How do we really get that primary triage? It's all right giving them secondary triage, but what about the primary triage? And so that's where the big focus, that's where the SIV, that's where the calls come in. So there's got to be a really big, give some really, really serious thoughts of how do we deal with that? How do we back, so. There's a big school of thought in parts of New Zealand and with some of the funders of the ambulance service that you shouldn't even be receiving those calls. Well, you shouldn't be responding to those calls. You only respond to the high acuity. Well, what about the other 400,000 or 500,000? What do you expect to do with them?
Yeah.
So so that's a big focus, and I think the integrated workforce in rural areas needs a lot more work. There's not enough justification to have a primary care, ECP type person in a rural area in New Zealand. There's just not enough work for them. But the mixed model of working on an ambulance, responding to a call, when there's an ambulance call, as it were, but also working in GP surgery or look at urgent centre, doing both. We've got some great examples of that.
Yeah.
And there needs to be more of that because we're just too small, and the workforce is too small to have this siloed workforce. So there needs to be a bit more openness about that, and less sort of, because that's a constraint at times. Oh, well, I'm not employing them; they're employing them. They'll work for me. They can't do. So just be, we are too small to be able to have that divide. So
yeah, you need to be more fluid, don't you?
Yeah.
And I think that would give such good, professional development.
Oh, and people want to break. People want to break, right? Spend 10 years on an ambulance. You say, well, actually, if I can work in a GP surgery part time, then I might return for a while. It's like having people who are in single response cars for year after year after year. At the end, it gets them. It gets to them. They need a break.
And it goes back to a little bit of the conversation earlier when you talked about, we talked about the performance targets.
Yeah.
And, the thing that has always sat with me since I was young was that I remember a manager coming to the station to thank me once because I'd met all my response targets. And I remember asking him and saying, that's great, but that patient actually died. And I said, but I saved the next one that you just told me I didn't meet my target.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's always resonated with me. Like I was just young and thinking, why are you congratulating me on a time when a patient died? And I think when we get the primary triage right, we focus on actually right care, right time. I think that's where we'll get real value as a service.
I agree. I think the other reflection I've got, and I mentioned to the team a few months ago, that the pendulum swung. We've gone from being seen as lights and siren and big car, by the public, car accidents and all the major traumas to sort of the more of the primary care and the secondary triage, which is all good, all well and good, but we still do that. The STEMIs, the strokes, the major trauma, and so I've just been saying to the team, we need to make sure that the pendulum swung a bit too far the other way now. So, we'll be brought in a national STEMI pathway, national trauma, So how do we make sure that there's a focus on that still? Because that's where the patient outcome evidence can be more profound, right? Even at small numbers. So I think we've got to be make sure we get that balance right and make sure we remind the politician and our purchasers that we've still got a very important role to play, STEMI, stroke, major trauma, spinal cord, in those areas. And I think also in New Zealand at least, what's the next step for us in terms of those areas to try and make more of a difference, I think.
Yeah, so important. If you had to give young Pete, when he's starting his journey, is there to where you are today, is there something you wish you told yourself or thought about back then? Some advice you'd give yourself, I should say?
Well, it's the usual thing, isn't it? I'm a bit of a people pleaser. I think it's the old thing, you can't please all people all the time, and you have to be prepared to make tough calls. And a well-informed tough call, so for me, just being prepared, accept that you can't keep everyone happy, but do the right thing at the right time for the right reason, and then get behind it and take your team with you. Yeah.
I think it's so important in ambulance actually to be said, because I think one of the challenges, I've obviously moved countries, I've worked in different states around Australia. Yeah. And but a lot of the services I go to with the leaders that I meet, they have started when they're young and they're working their way up that kind of ladder as they see it. And then they're suddenly now having to tell their friends what to do. And that's a really hard balance. And so I think it goes back to your core, which you talked about, your values, is actually just being a nice person, actually.
Being a nice person helps, and being personable and being down to earth, right? You've got to be able to connect with them. And I think that's a really important point, actually. I think what I see, one of the most important skills an ambulance leader can have is, and it sounds obvious, but changing your tone, changing your language, changing how you approach conversations with different groups of people.
Yeah.
There's a skill to that. And there's no point talking about management speak to frontline staff, not because they're thick, but because it's not interesting to them. There's no interest. You've got to say, what is it? How am I going to change my communication style to work for them, not for me, for them. And also, a final point would be that just about the honesty thing, and people connect with that. You want to, so when I became chief executive on an ambulance service, it was a difficult place to work, and we were really struggling, and we'd never been honest with the media about that. And I went on TV and asked me a question, and said, we're struggling. It's that we are struggling, and that's really resonated with our people, frontline staff. At last, someone's prepared to be honest.
Yeah.
Not blaming anyone else, just saying we're struggling, and that being vulnerable and showing that was really important.
That's great.
I think that's pretty powerful. Look, as we close, this is the final episode of the Great Divide series. What really stands out to me is that we've been exploring that divide, and that it's not really about distance, density, geography, or distance. it's really about people leadership and the systems we choose to build. And Peter, I think your really fundamental core values of leadership, being a decent human being, has really resonated with certainly the way I lead, and I know the way Lindsay leads as well. And we've heard that's actually similar theme from leaders right across the series, that you're all facing very similar pressures.
Yeah.
And it's those remarkably human decisions in moments that matter. And you can't always please everybody, as you've just said. I think, if there's one takeaway, it's learning across the systems isn't just possible, it's really essential.
Yeah.
So really just want to thank everyone who's joined us throughout this series, and a really special thank you to Peter for sharing decades of experience across the globe. We hope these conversations have sparked reflection for everybody, challenged assumptions, and really encourage you to keep asking better questions about the future of ambulance services.
Nice.
And thanks again for joining us, Peter.
Thanks for the invite. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
Thank you.